I recently read Occult Feminism by Rachel Wilson, a book that came out in 2021. Wilson is an Orthodox Christian who wrote this book as a way to uncover hidden truths about the feminist movement, largely involving goddess worship, secret cults, and witchcraft. As a fellow anti-feminist who is also a woman of science, I wanted to read this book critically, considering how widely popular it is in red pill circles. Unfortunately, the book mostly mixes conspiratorial thinking with religious fanaticism. I will quickly note that I am not going to criticize this book on the basis of Wilson's religious views, but on the basis of her overarching claims, which are incredibly sketchy. My name is Zarina Matcha, and you're watching The Rational Female. If you enjoy my content, give the video a like, subscribe to my channel, and hit the bell to stay notified on all future uploads. I'll be critiquing occult feminism, and then I'll be discussing anti-feminist books that I would actually recommend to others. My main problem with this book is that it entirely misses the point of why feminism has historically been so problematic. The other books I have read criticizing feminism focus on family breakdown, no-fault divorce, institutionalized misandry, and they examine male and female historical dynamics. I am concerned that people who want to read more anti-feminist books may read Occult Feminism and walk away with a bunch of information that reads like what teenagers discussing the Illuminati on the internet wrote. Obviously, it's important to have an open dialogue, and there are a few things that Wilson says in the book that I do agree with. She could have written a very good, structured critique of feminism without compromising her Christian beliefs. Unfortunately, she's written a book that is more suited to a discussion on conspiracy theories and secret cults rather than actual gender politics. She starts by claiming that feminism bore out of paganism. It actually bore out of the European Enlightenment, along with other revolutionary movements. I understand feminism to largely be a secular materialist ideology that emerged from multiple intellectual and political traditions, particularly the French Revolution. The two earliest proto-feminist texts were the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen by Olympe de Gouges and A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft. I have stated in multiple videos that feminism is a Marxist-based ideology. I'll clarify what I mean by this, as it's not entirely accurate and it's a bit of a simplistic claim. Radical and intersectional feminism, of which I would assert that Marxist, socialist, and anarchist feminism are offshoots of, are heavily influenced by Marxist cultural analysis. The foundational text for this was Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, which is where the idea of gender being a social construct was crystallized. De Beauvoir was deeply influenced by Marxism, and The Second Sex inspired the ideas of Betty Friedan and later feminists. Although first-wave feminism claimed to be founded upon liberal ideas of equality, the actual goals were revolutionary in theory and practice, as seen with documents like the Declaration of Sentiments. This document literally claims that human history is a story of female subjugation under male tyranny, thus sowing the seeds of the misandry prevalent in later feminist waves. The Marxist cultural framework is used to categorize men and women into two distinct classes, mirroring the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Hence, the idea of women as an oppressed class is heavily inspired through a Marxist-based framework. This is why feminism is viewed largely as a radical left-wing ideology, and why many feminists don't consider right-wing or conservative feminism to be real feminism. Now, I did come across an article from feminist Jessa Crispin claiming that theosophy, spiritualism, and paganism were part of the roots of feminism. Certain branches of feminism definitely do discuss witchcraft and deity worship, although I've never come across this in any of the feminist texts that I have read. This is because it's not actually mainstream. Spirituality, goddess worship, and neo-paganism represent specific currents within the broader feminist tradition, not feminism as a whole. Plus, there are plenty of people who practice neo-paganism or New Age spirituality who have no affiliation with any political movement, feminist or otherwise. And more to the point, does this actually matter? Whatever feminists do or don't worship doesn't change the core of the ideology, which is misandrist and anti-family. I'm not sure why it matters whether some feminists happen to worship goddesses or not. Most of human history has been about people believing in strange things, including Wilson herself. I think the critiques of feminism should focus on the actual effects on families, men and women, not on esoteric beliefs that some within the movement may have held. Wilson draws a lot of parallels between feminism and worshipping goddesses. Polytheism and the worship of deities dates all the way back to ancient civilizations, long before Christianity was invented. The world's oldest religion is said to be Hinduism. Goddess worship is a prevalent part of Hinduism and is also practiced in other belief systems. The various forms of the goddesses are understood as manifestations of Shakti, the divine feminine cosmic power. It's well known that polytheism was largely practiced in many ancient cultures. Zoroastrianism is one of the world's oldest religions, and goddess worship was also a part of this. Polytheism was commonplace in ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, which Wilson does mention. The Orisha are a collection of deities within Yoruba spirituality. Even in pre-Islamic Arabia, goddess worship was practiced. Celtic mythology also involved polytheistic worship before the rise of Christianity. The word pagan predates Christianity, but Christians played a major role in turning it into a broad religious category for non-Christians. Paganism has been reclaimed in modern times as a sort of nature-worshipping religion. But for thousands of years, people practiced a huge variety of indigenous and polytheistic religious traditions that can be grouped together under the umbrella term paganism. It's not really accurate to correlate the modern practices within New Age spiritualism with ancient polytheistic and pagan traditions. Modern neo-paganism includes reconstructions of some ancient traditions as well as modern creations, such as Wicca. And more to the point, deity worship was a spiritual practice. We're talking about correlating a collection of ancient belief systems modified for the present day with Western feminism, a political philosophy that has only been around since the 1700s. How can we connote traditions that span millennia with a movement that is comparably recent? Wilson later goes on to heavily criticize the Protestant Reformation, claiming that Anabaptists, Pilgrims, Puritans, and Quakers were not real Christians because they were rebelling against the Orthodox and Catholic churches. She insists that further denominations like Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, and Shakers were all part of some pretty bizarre religious cults. I'm not sure what right she has to claim that someone is not a real Christian because they don't fit into her worldview of what a Christian is. Obviously, to me, being an atheist, it's all the same, but there's something very strange here. Wilson seems to be staunchly critical of anyone who doesn't fit into her worldview of strict Orthodox Christianity. Anyone who follows another branch of Christianity is somehow a false Christian. She insists that these later formed Christian denominations were not Christian, they were occult groups. Chapter 5 steers heavily into Illuminati, conspiracy theory, secret families controlling the world, banks rhetoric. I'm not saying this is all necessarily untrue, but I am saying that this further lends this book to being a conspiracy book as opposed to a structured critique of feminism. To be honest, much of the book is really her criticizing religious and spiritual practices that she doesn't agree with. She talks about feminism for maybe half the book. I actually do agree that many New Age spiritual practices are quite dangerous, and I would argue that many people within these spaces often engage in drug use. Based on many of the claims she makes in her book about certain people having certain experiences, I would suggest that they either may have been on drugs or having hallucinations. It's possible that people who claim to be connecting to the other side may be experiencing psychotic symptoms. I'm not a doctor, but I do know quite a bit about this, considering all of this literally happened to me a few years ago. On page 82, she explicitly states that practitioners of Theosophy and New Ageism are communicating with demonic entities. I don't know who seriously needs to hear this, but demonic entities do not exist. Psychosis and delusions are very real. Drugs will mess with your brain and make you see things that are not there. It's interesting how she repeatedly discusses figures like Helena Blavatsky and Aleister Crowley, who were incredibly messed up people, yet she never talks about Christian priests molesting children or evil Christian zealots like Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, who was a lunatic that forced boys not to masturbate. She also discusses astrology, numerology, and tarot cards, all of which have been around for centuries. None of this stuff is new, it was all practiced in older civilizations. She also goes on about vegetarianism as some sort of political agenda somehow, rather than a personal lifestyle choice. That's really confused me. Plenty of people don't eat meat for health reasons, or because they genuinely care about animal cruelty. What exactly is wrong with that? I have known people who are vegetarian and people who are vegan, and none ever force abstinence from meat down my throat. The book is overall a complete mess, and it's more of a critique of New Age spirituality and the Protestant Reformation than feminism. There were a few things she mentioned that I liked, such as male chivalry and female historical power in ancient Egypt, Rome, and the Middle Ages. However, it's otherwise largely a rambling pile of nonsense. If you're planning to read this book, please don't take most of it literally. I'm incredibly concerned that people who want to examine feminism critically will read this and miss a lot of the actual problems with feminism that are not rooted in conspiratorial thinking. I am now going to give a list of books I have read that do critique feminism 10,000 times better than Rachel Wilson's book. These books dive into culture, politics, biology, psychology, sociology, and are highly evidence-based rather than conspiratorial. I'll start with a bunch of books I would recommend to those just getting into anti-feminism and men's issues, and then delve into some more hardcore books, and also books that I wouldn't personally recommend. First up is Sex Matters by Mona Charen. This is a great book to start with. I would recommend it to everyone. She mostly criticizes post-second wave feminism and focuses on female unhappiness, the consequences of the sexual revolution, single-parent families and their impact on children, and ways in which men and women are different. She also brings up stats on how feminism harmed the African American community, which I thought was great. The thing that I liked and took most from her book was the idea of feminine modesty and masculine honor, and advocating for traditional standards of masculine and feminine behavior, which emphasized courtship and mutual respect between the sexes, rather than claiming victimhood or hatred. Next is Free Women, Free Men by Camille Paglia. This is one of my overall favorite books critiquing feminism. Camille Paglia is a libertarian, and she talks a lot about libertarianism in this book. It's a collection of essays focusing on politics, feminism, and gender issues. There's a lot of humor sprinkled throughout the book, and I loved the writing style. She also discusses critical theory, deconstructionism, and neo-Marxist ideas. Paglia does identify as a feminist, although she is highly critical of feminism and is dubbed anti-feminist by some. The Myth of Male Power by Warren Farrell is the go-to book for anyone who wants to learn about men's issues. It's an in-depth look at how patriarchal societies have been set up for the disposability of men and protection of women. It explores how war, marriage, and work have been set up to make things tough for men. This is a heavier read than the other two, and it does get quite repetitive. However, it presents excellent points, and I would recommend everyone to read it. Is There Anything Good About Men by Roy Baumeister is another book that discusses male disposability. I found it a bit lighter than The Myth of Male Power, and I would recommend it to anyone who wants to dip their toes into men's issues. It talks a lot about male and female roles and cultural and biological differences. Very good read. The Flip Side of Feminism by Suzanne Venker and Phyllis Schlafly is the first book I read critiquing feminism. I read this in 2020. It genuinely shocked me because it delivers an alternative viewpoint of the feminist movement compared to the one we learn about in school or in the mainstream media. It discusses how feminism lobbied against families, motherhood, and marriage. It also talks about the Marxist roots of second-wave feminism and how feminist philosophy has a lot in common with Marxist theories of revolution and overthrowing the bourgeoisie. Who Stole Feminism by Christina Hoff Sommers is definitely worth a read. However, it repeats some of the things I already read in some of the other books. I didn't enjoy the writing style as much, as I found it very dry and academic, which overall didn't make for as enjoyable reading. But overall, it's a very, very good book. I came to have some gripes against Christina Hoff Sommers in 2023 when I discovered the work of Janice Fiamengo. I was a bit shocked because both Sommers and Paglia heavily praise first-wave feminism. You'll find that most people who critique feminism largely praise the first wave and then criticize the later waves. As discussed with Steve Brule recently on my podcast, most people simply haven't dug deep enough into the history of feminism to see the actual terrible origins of it. This is also why I find the popularity of Rachel Wilson's book quite depressing. She delves deep into the first wave of feminism, and instead of discussing the misandry and victimhood, she turns it into a conspiracy theory about witchcraft and satanic rituals. Loving Men, Respecting Women by Tim Goldich is a book I am currently reading, and so far it's very good. I am very familiar with Tim's work as he is a regular guest on my podcast. He talks a lot about mirror opposites and the concept of female power and male victimization as the politicized male perspective, which feminism ignores. He presents the gender equalist worldview, which is that when you look across the board, both men and women faced historical hardships and privileges. In his words, it all balances out. Now, I would like to list 4 books that provide stronger criticisms of feminism, as they heavily criticize all waves of feminism and challenge the view of feminism ever having been positive. Feminism, Myths, Lies, and Ungratefulness by Nick Buckley is my favorite anti-feminist book that I have read so far. It's quite short and very easy to read, but he goes into great detail. He discusses the suffragettes, the wage gap, different types of feminism, domestic violence, gender, and biology. So much is covered within such a short space. I love it, and I think that everyone who is strongly against feminism and wants a strong critique of feminism should read this book. The Feminist Lie by Bob Lewis is another fantastic book that is also very short and packs a punch. Everything he says is well backed up and strongly argued. This is another favorite of mine for sure. The Suffragette Bombers by Simon Webb is key to understanding the suffragettes and the truth about women's voting in the UK. Webb uncovers who they were and how dreadfully classist, sexist, and racist they were, and how they were actually angry bigots, not heroes of women. The Rational Male by Rollo Tomasi is quite interesting. I wasn't sure what to expect from this book, but I actually really enjoyed it. It presents quite a positive and pragmatic outline of gender relations, which surprised me. I personally would have substituted his phrase feminine imperative for feminist imperative. I obviously didn't agree with everything, and it's clearly aimed at men, but it's generally interesting reading. Now, here are 2 books I have referred to in some of my videos that aren't exactly criticizing feminism, but they're definitely important to understand the biological differences between men and women. The End of Gender by Debra Soh is one of my favorite books. It's very accessible and not a difficult read if you want to understand neurological differences between men and women. She addresses the trans issue with a lot of care, and she debunks a lot of lies being pushed by the woke brigade. Highly recommended reading. The Female Brain by Luann Brizardine is another excellent book. I wouldn't say she is necessarily pro-feminist or anti-feminist, but she does criticize the social constructionist narrative perpetuated by feminism. She provides in-depth analysis and detail on the neurological structures and differences in female brains compared to male brains. Feminists hate this book because it flies in the face of their gender is a social construct worldview. Cordelia Fine wrote an entire book called Delusions of Gender, which is largely a critique of ideas outlined in books like The Female Brain. Now for 2 anti-feminist books I have read that I would not recommend to anyone. The Manipulated Man by Esther Villa is the only anti-feminist book I read that I genuinely hated. It is vile. I was so disappointed as I expected an interesting discussion on subtle, manipulative female behavior. Instead, it's poorly written, repetitive, unscientific, and incredibly misogynistic. She spends the entire book saying that men work and women do nothing and just exploit them. This isn't even true. Women have always worked, both inside and outside the home. She repeatedly calls women stupid, and I wondered if the book was supposed to be a satire. It actually isn't. And obviously, as mentioned, Occult Feminism by Rachel Wilson. These are definitely the two worst books I have read that critique feminism. If you are going to read them, please take them with a grain of salt. Finally, here are a bunch of anti-feminist books that I own but haven't fully read yet. Domestic Tranquility by F. Carolyn Graglia, The Boy Crisis by Warren Farrell, The Privileged Sex by Martin Van Creveld, and Matricensis by David Shackleton. I did a great video with him on my channel, which you should check out. I have also ordered a copy of Janice Fiamengo's new book, The Goddess That Failed, which I have added to my ever-growing reading list. I hope you enjoyed this video. All links to all the books mentioned are in the description box. Do let me know your thoughts on this below, and if you've read any of these books, please let me know in the comments. For regular essays critiquing feminism, follow my Rational Female Substack. Link is available here or in the description below. To support the channel further, consider buying me a coffee via this link. Your support really helps me out a lot.